Hello and welcome from Clut World Languages. My name is Kamala Weedy and I'm the marketing coordinator here at Clut World Languages. And I will just get us started. We want to do a quick practice of using the chat feature just to kind of warm up and make sure everyone is paying attention. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions and I just want you to use the chat feature to answer. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, first question. Who here likes the city of Chicago? The Chicago is where our office is actually located. And so we are in Chicago, the beautiful city. Oh, some have never been to Chicago. Okay, I see some people do. That's great. I also really love Chicago the few times that I've been there. I'm actually a remote worker, so I'm joining you virtually from Minnesota tonight. Chicago is wonderful. Yes, it is. All right, and for those of you who haven't gone, it is a great city. So second question. How many of you, gosh, I have to think, I just forgot my question. I'm so sorry. How many of you are really excited to kind of get together and see people again and are starting to travel and meet up with people that you haven't met in a while? Go ahead and put your answers in the chat. Oh, I see traveling. Oh, good. I hope you are traveling. I hope that you're seeing lots of good people that you've missed. Yes, wonderful. Love traveling. Me too. Me too. Okay, great. And now, how many of you consider yourselves to be lifelong learners? Yes, 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 yes. I feel like this is, oh, always. This is a good question for teachers. I'm sure you all feel that way. I know I certainly do. And so great. That's why I'm here. That's right. So now I have a little bit of exciting news for those of you who answered yes, or said that you liked Chicago, liked getting together with people, and liked lifelong learning. We are having a conference, Clut World Languages Conference. We have a beautiful picture of Chicago there, honing our craft, current trends in world language teaching and learning. It's this October and you can sign up now. So we're going to put a link in the chat. And if you're interested, please go check out this website. Let me type it in. Yeah, so we're really excited about it and we hope to see you there. So that's just our little plug for that. Now we'll get started with our session for tonight. First, we will be sending out a feedback survey afterwards, and we would love it if you filled that out. Your feedback is so important. These are why these webinars are for you. You're why we do them. And so hearing your feedback and getting that helps us to bring you better, great content in the future as well. So please fill out that survey that we will be sending out at the end. And now I want to hand it over to Catherine Miner. She's our French consultant here at Clut World Languages. So thank you so much, Catherine. Have a good session.
Thank you so much, Kamala. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much for making the time to join us during this particularly busy period as we near the end of what we know has been a particularly busy school year for all of us. As Kamala said, my name is Catherine Miner, and I am the French program consultant here at Clut World Languages. Many of you may already know us from our materials or from some previous webinars you may have attended, but for those who might be joining us for the first time, I just want to let you know that at KWL, our mission is to provide high quality and innovative materials to teachers and students of Spanish, French, German, and Italian that are grounded in the most current research and methodologies in second language acquisition pedagogy. And we're also committed to bringing you extensive opportunities for professional development with leading figures in the field. So to that end, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker for this evening, Scott Thornbury. Scott is an internationally recognized academic and teacher trainer in the field of English language teaching. He has, until recently, taught an online master's in TESOL, Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages, a program at the New School in New York. Scott Thornbury he's written over a dozen books for teachers on language and methodology, and two of these, Natural Grammar and Teaching Unplugged, have won the British Council's Elton Award for Innovation. He is also the series editor for the Cambridge Handbooks for Language Teachers and a trustee of the Hands Up Project, which promotes drama activities in English for children in under-resourced regions of the Arab world. And his website is scottthornbury.com. So without further ado, I will turn the presentation over to Scott for his presentation this evening. Our language is different. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Kamala, for that introduction. Welcome, everybody. While we're on the subject of using the chat, maybe you could just type into the chat where you actually are joining us from, and also what language you teach, just to give me an idea of who we've got here in the room. So you're okay. Jean, French, Texas, German, Spanish, Dallas. Okay, good, excellent. French and Latin. Wow. Okay, Spanish. All the way over in California, Spanish. Okay, terrific. And that's kind of what I was predicting. Russian and German. Ludmilla, great. And some of you are teaching English. Good, a good range of modern languages here, and including one or two ancient ones. Okay, let me just share my screen and the sound. What I want to do, as Kamala said, we've got a kind of a presentation followed by question and answers, but feel free to post questions into the chat as we go along. I'll keep an eye on them, and we can try and make this as interactive as possible. I'm speaking to you from Spain, where I live and have been living for the last many, many years. As Catherine pointed out, I'm a teacher of English and a trainer of teachers of English, but increasingly over the last however many years, I've been involved in talking to teachers of other languages apart from English. And this has been very interesting challenge for me as somebody who's basically grounded in English language teaching, to look at how the teaching of other languages is being mediated, the materials that are being used, the methodology, etc. And that's really the focus of this talk today. I'm also a student of languages, of course, and so a student of Spanish as a second language, a lifelong learner of Spanish and of Catalan, because I live in the Catalan-speaking part of Spain. And I do have a long history of learning modern languages at school in New Zealand, where I'm from originally. I learned French, German, and Latin. And over the years, I've had, because of one reason or the other, I've had contact with such languages as Arabic, because I lived in Egypt for a period of time, and Maori, which is the language of the indigenous people of New Zealand, my country. So I'm a kind of lifelong student, as Kamala said, and I'm obsessively interested in language learning and language teaching. And that's really what I want to address with you today. And my starting point is that quotation from a book for teachers of modern languages that was published over 100 years ago. And it's actually still in print, interestingly enough. And in this book, the writer Karl Broyle makes the point that, he said this in 1899, modern languages should not be taught in the same way as the ancient tongues. The ancient tongues meaning, of course, Latin and Greek. And if you think back over 100 years, it was very much the approach, in as much as we know, that the teaching of modern languages followed very closely upon the model that had been established in schools for the teaching of Latin and Greek. Interestingly enough, while I was researching this talk just last month, this article came out in the Guardian newspaper, where the teaching of Latin was the focus here, and the some Cambridge University academic was suggesting that Latin should not be taught as a dead language, and that by integrating, for example, in the case in this example, the use of lyrics of songs by Taylor Swift, they could make the teaching of a dead language much more alive. And this is a quote from that particular article. This Cambridge University academic suggests that Latin should be taught more like a modern foreign language, as opposed to an ancient language, where students are encouraged to speak, sing, perform, or write creatively, rather than just learning vocabulary and grammar from a primer. And so one of the suggestions that this academic made was that translating hit songs into Latin, i.e. that's the reference to Taylor Swift, could enhance students' grasp of the different techniques used in Roman poetry. And this, I think, is an ongoing theme. How do you make the teaching of dead languages more interesting? But I think it's ironic, I have to say, that the academic assumes that the teaching of modern languages has moved on from that kind of classical language model. And my own experience suggests yes and no. I mean, there is still, and this is not just for languages like German and Italian and Spanish, but also for English, there is a tendency to fall back on the teaching of dead languages as the sort of default setting. And so I just want a little bit of history here. A major innovation in the teaching of foreign languages, modern languages, occurred over 40 years ago with the advent of what was called the threshold level for modern languages, not just English, but across Europe. So this was a European initiative to sort of standardize the teaching of modern languages. And they recognized that, yes, languages, that there is an enormous amount of diversity even within Europe, and more so, much more so than then. I mean, you can look at the map there on the cover of the book, and of course, Europe now extends much further east than those highlighted countries. But they say, in spite of their diversity, the sociocultural background of these countries is sufficiently homogeneous to justify the assumption that large classes of foreign language learners will want to use the foreign language for approximately the same purposes. Yeah, that whether you're studying German, you're studying Italian, you're studying Swedish, you're studying Spanish, you will want to learn them for approximately the same purposes. The point of this initiative is to say, what are these purposes? And how can we kind of generalize across different languages for these common purposes? And I'll come back to the point of what these purposes were in a minute. But when the threshold level was being kind of recalibrated in the early days of this century, 2001, and reformulated or elaborated, if you like, in the form of the Common European Framework, they made the point in this document, 2001, that it is remarkable to what extent that original framework from 1980 proved appropriate and adequate for 20 European languages, even from different language families. That is to say that this original idea that let's standardize the teaching of different languages so that we're more or less marching to the beat of the same drum, that we have the same overall purposes, this has stood the test of time. This was in 2000. So again, it's going back 20 years, but I would suggest that nothing's changed here, that the feeling is, yes, that there is a common purpose involved in teaching modern languages, irrespective of what the language is. And what is that common purpose? Well, they define it in this same document. They said, for many years, the Council of Europe has promoted an approach based on the communicative needs of learners. And that's the key word there, the communicative needs of learners. So this is the common purpose of whether you're learning French, whether you're learning Italian, whether you're learning Swahili, that for most learners, the objective is that they are able to communicate in that language, either through speaking or writing or both. But the key purpose there, the common purpose, is communication. And hence the Common European Framework and its original form, the threshold level, were very much grounded in what we know now as the communicative approach. The communicative approach to teaching English, Spanish, Italian, French, Russian, whatever. What is, though, the communicative approach? Let's just quickly resume what is meant by the communicative approach. And there's a kind of neat summary here from an article that came out relatively recently, defining what it is that is the general understanding of the communicative approach. And this is point one, that activities, classroom activities, promote real communication. Yeah, that's the kind of overall justification for whatever we do in the classroom. Real communication, that is, they engage learners in the authentic, functional use of language. Functional meaning to do things with language. Yeah, and this was the great innovation of the Common European Framework, that it described language not in terms of its grammar, its vocabulary, its phonology necessarily, but what people do with the language, the kind of competencies that they need to acquire to become a user of that language rather than simply a learner of the language. The second point is that the situations in the classroom, these activities that we set up, should resemble, should replicate real life communication as much as possible. Now, of course, classrooms are different. We know the classroom is a world unto itself, and things happen in classrooms that don't happen in the real world. But the idea is that as much as possible, what goes on in the classroom should somehow replicate what will happen when the learner uses that language outside the classroom for their whatever communicative purposes they have. And that follows, therefore, that fluency, and this was one of the major kind of shifts I think the communicative approach introduced, that fluency was more important than accuracy. So when I first started teaching, as I was trained as a teacher in what might be called late stage audiolingualism, you know, using language laboratories and lots of pattern practice drills, etc., the focus was very much on accuracy. Get it right, get it right, get it right. Don't make mistakes. Yeah, the fluency will follow. And of course, many learners over many generations of learners will testify that, in fact, accuracy doesn't necessarily result in fluency. There's not an automatic correlation between being accurate in the language and becoming fluent in the language. So the whole communicative movement moved the emphasis away from accuracy for its own sake onto fluency. And that finally, a defining feature of the communicative approach is these typical communicative activities like role plays, discussions, problem solving, tasks, simulations, process. Again, the sort of thing that academic in Cambridge was talking about with regard to Latin, that what they wanted to do was not teach Latin as a dead language, but integrate these kinds of activities into the teaching of an otherwise dead language. So those are, I think, that's as good a summary as I've found of what the major principles and characteristics of the communicative approach are. And this is across languages, yeah? So this is not specific to English, although it has to be said, because English dominates to a large extent, not just in terms of being a global language, but also it has dominated the development of methodologies and materials. And what I've found is that talking to teachers of other languages, there's sometimes a certain resistance to the wholesale adoption of these principles for their teaching of their languages, whether it's German, Italian, Russian, Chinese, Japanese, or whatever. And the feeling is, and I'm not saying this represents the feeling in the room, but the feeling often is that no, well, actually, this is all very well for English, but our language is different because our language, for example, is more difficult, or our language requires a higher standard of accuracy, or in the case of threatened languages, our language is threatened, is at risk, and it needs protection and respect. And I found this in my own experience as a learner, for example, of Catalan, here in Spain that Catalan, which is considered a language at risk, the feeling is that no, we need a different kind of methodology for Catalan because we can't tolerate the kind of inaccurate Catalan that is often spoken because it threatens the whole nature of the language. Now, whatever you think about this, these are opinions that need to be respected. And I certainly do respect them. But what I want to do, though, in this talk is kind of problematize this resistance to adopting the communicative approach for the teaching of other languages apart from English. And so I want to look at 3 questions. And I think you've been sent these questions in the survey preceding this talk. And I want to organize this talk around those 3 questions, these 3 questions. First one being, are some languages more difficult than others? And then looking at how they're acquired as a first language, as a mother tongue, are they acquired differently? And then finally, should they be taught differently? And that's my agenda. And let's have a look at the first question. Are some languages more difficult than others? And I think the answer in the survey was generally, I think there was a kind of 50-50 spread of opinion here that yes, some languages are more difficult than others. And I think this is intuitive. I mean, there's a feeling if you have learned other languages that yes, it takes longer to reach the same level of competence in certain languages than in others. And it's because of where you're starting from. So, for example, there's a very large language teaching organization in the United States called the Foreign Service Institute, which trains military people, it trains diplomats, etc., in a huge range of different languages. And they actually categorize languages in terms of their level of difficulty or how long they will take roughly to get to a kind of degree of competence. So they have category 1, and you can see these are the languages. Now, this is for English speakers. Yeah. So we have a number of languages. Actually, interestingly enough, probably a lot of the languages that are represented in this room that are considered to be relatively easy because they are somehow closely related to English. So we have French, Italian, Spanish, Swedish, etc. Moving up the scale of difficulty, we get languages like German, which are considered to be, it's going to take a little bit longer. And then if we go into the category 4, we see that, there are a lot of languages which are considered to be going to take twice as long to learn if you're learning Spanish, for example, or Italian, if your starting point is English. And then at the very end of the scale, there's those kind of completely off the board languages that are considered to be incredibly difficult. And these are Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. The question is, on what grounds have these decisions been made, apart from the experience of learners over many years? I think one of the arguments that you used or assumed is that it's all to do with the grammar, despite the fact that if anybody here knows anything about Chinese, there's actually not a lot of grammar in Chinese. It's an incredibly easy language from the point of view of the grammar, no tenses, no aspects, etc. But whatever. This assumption is that it's the grammar that makes these languages difficult. And one of the, for English speakers, and of course, it's a well-known fact, it doesn't take a lot of research to discover that, yes, okay, some languages are inflected more than others. This comes from a handy little book that I travel with, still, Spanish Verb Simplified, 1970. Here is the inflections for the verb form in, for the irregular verb tener in Spanish. You can see there's hundreds of different forms of the verb. So it follows, so Spanish is difficult because it has a huge learning load in terms of all these different inflections, which is the point I want to come back to. And of course, if you compare it with English, you find that English is very, very simple. It's a virtually uninflected language, despite the attempts of some writers of grammars to present English as if it were an inflected language. Now, this comes from a grammar 1947, and this is for what they call the imperfect tense, or the past tense, if you like, of to have and to come. And if you look at that, you see there's not a single inflection there. It's had, or can. Nevertheless, this was the mindset, and it still pervades a lot of materials, is to present English as if it were just another inflected language, which it clearly isn't. And therefore, but the argument is, of course, well, that makes English very simple, very easy, and it makes Spanish difficult for speakers of English. But of course, this doesn't represent the full range of complexity in a language like English, for example. Just because it's not inflected doesn't mean to say that it's simple. And if we look at, the verb form in English more closely, we can see, okay, yeah, it's not inflected, but there are a lot of little words that are used to create the same effect as the inflections in, for example, Spanish. You've got all these auxiliary verbs. And that is where the challenge is. So it's, okay, just because it's not inflected doesn't mean to say that the grammar is necessarily easy. And what's interesting for me is when you look at the kinds of errors learners make when they are learning, when they're speaking or writing English, you can see that the problems learners have with English are not in the kind of verb form. We tend to think of like languages, this is something we've inherited from the teaching of dead languages like Latin and Greek, that language is all about learning the different verbs. That grammar is verbs and verb inflections, etc., or in this case, auxiliaries. But if you take an example of a piece of text that's been written by a learner in English, so this is a Mexican learner of English, so Spanish speaker, he was asked to write a little text about how do you use English in your work. And if you look at this text, you'll see that, okay, there are a lot of problems here in terms of whether it's target-like. But I would argue that the problems are not grammatical in the sense that we understand grammar traditionally. They're often about the little words in English. For example, if you take, I use what all the time, no pronoun, or the wrong preposition. I'm trying to apply not to, but for, or the wrong article, or again, the missing article at university, or the wrong article, and sometimes they're lexical problems, using the word idiom, for example, rather than language, or again, wrong article, the wrong word, traduction, obviously a interference from Spanish, wrong preposition, particle omission, word order, wrong determiner, wrong choice of voice. In this case, that is a verb problem. I think I need to dedicate time to learn this language. That time needs to be dedicated to learning this language, wrong form of the verb, etc. The point I'm trying to make here is that there's more grammar to a language, whether it's English or German or Spanish or Italian, than is represented in these kind of traditional verb tables. So that's what constitutes the problem for learners. This is the distance that a Spanish speaker in this case has with English. It's not about the verb forms, as we've said, they're not inflected, but it's all about the little words in English, the articles, the prepositions, etc. So just because English looks simple, it's not necessarily simple. And in this article from a book about language myths written by linguists, incidentally, they said language A, whether it's Spanish or German or Japanese or Chinese, may have more complex systems than language B in one area. That is to say, we've seen that Spanish is more inflected than English. And it's less complex in other areas, but we cannot say that one language has more grammar than another. We cannot sensibly quantify the amount of grammar the language has. And the point here is that all languages have immensely complex grammatical systems. I mean, you could say there's some exceptions there. You could say Esperanto, for example, was designed to be simple. But in fact, you know, if you look at Esperanto, it's actually much more complex than it need be. But all languages, the point is here, are complex in some way, but it may be in different ways. So going back to our, you know, those categories of difficulty for English speakers, yes, Chinese we saw was rated one of the most difficult languages, but it's not grammatically complex in terms that when you compare it to English, in terms of the verb system, for example, but it is challenging in other respects. So what are these respects? Well, and the point of this quotation is to argue that the difference between languages, the grammatical difference, that is the structural distance, is often assumed to be what makes languages more difficult than others. But research shows so that while structural distance, that is the grammatical distance between languages, is an attractive candidate for explaining language learning difficulty. Why is this? Why does it take longer to learn this language than as opposed to that one? Oh, well, it must be the grammar. Research shows that the typological distance, that is, so languages that are arranged, that share common histories, like Swedish, for example, and Norwegian and English and German, it does not translate directly into the level of difficulty. And there are other powerful factors at work, such as the lexicon, the vocabulary, the phonological system. Now, this is the problem with Chinese, the tones, the writing system. That's the problem with Arabic, a whole different script. And very importantly, the cultural distance. How familiar is the learner with the target language culture? How much do they share, etc. So the point of this is saying it's not about the grammar so much as these other factors. And another writer in the same book goes on to say, well, actually, it's all about the vocabulary. And they make the point that the difficult thing about learning a language is the vocabulary, whether it's your own language or a foreign language. So, I mean, the grammar is in place in our first language by the time we go to school. But vocabulary is a lifelong task. We're always learning vocabulary in our own language, and certainly in a second language. It never stops. And their conclusion is vocabulary is the most difficult part, and that which takes the longest time to learn. So it's not just about the grammar. So are different languages acquired differently? I mean, we're talking now about learning them as a first language, as your mother tongue. And I think following from what I've just said is that no language is more difficult than another one. It just depends what your starting point is. If your starting point is 0, then whether you're learning Chinese as your first language, or whether you're learning Russian as your first language, or Spanish or English as your first language, it's probably going to take the same amount of time. And it does. And it tends to follow the same kind of order. So if we look at how children, for example, learn, in this case, 3 different languages, English, Finnish, and Samoan, they follow exactly the same pattern. So in English, it's very, very simplified grammar. So this is a little, a child, probably about, I would say, I think 20 months into their second year. And they tend to use these 2-word utterances very commonly with a kind of anchor, like more car, more cereal, more cookie, more fish, or boot off, light off, pants off. Exactly the same thing happens in Finnish. Exactly the same, different words, but the same kind of elementary grammar. And the same thing happens in Samoan. So in other words, the order of acquisition the process of acquiring the first language is more or less the same, just with different vocabulary. And then that's the early stage. It gets more complex as we move through. So there's at least 3 stages where there's this kind of like 2-word, 3-word utterance with no grammar. And then stage 2, so the grammar starts to appear. And by stage 3, it's becoming more standard-like. But the same 3 stages are common across all languages. So we have stage 1, which is very much focused on the context. You don't need a lot of grammar because you're talking about the things that you can point to. See, it's pre-grammatical, and this stage is shared across languages. And then it starts to become more grammaticized at stage 2. And the languages start to show their individual properties. You say, yeah, this child is definitely speaking Russian, this child is speaking Swedish. You can start to see the grammar kicking in, and then it becomes more context sensitive and discourse oriented in stage 3. But those same stages are common across all languages. There's no difference whether you're learning Russian as your first language, Spanish, Italian, Chinese, or whatever. And we see this in learning second languages, the same thing. A big study was done in Europe in the 1990s. It was looking at migrants in Europe, how they were learning different languages. Yeah, so the different languages they were learning are those L2 across the top: English, German, Dutch, French, Swedish. And these are the languages they were coming from. So we've got migrants in Europe whose first language is Punjabi or Italian or Turkish, Arabic, Spanish, Finnish, learning these different languages. And they did a massive study of these different migrants and found, again, that they followed more or less the same stages as they learned these different languages. There was no difference in terms of the process of learning these languages. These are not in classroom, I should say. These are not classroom learners. These are learners who are working in these cultures, and they're picking up the language as they go along. The first stage is what's called the pragmatic phase. This is really, really similar to how students children learn their first language. No grammar. Yeah, so they're telling a story here, and they say things like, so they've got some pictures. They're describing what they see in the pictures. It's a little narrative, and they say things like, "She steal bread and run away." So no past tense. The sequence of activities is simply signaled by the word "and." She steal bread and run away. So run away was after she stole the bread. And then they get to a lexical phase where they rely more on words to signal the kind of grammatical distinctions. So words like "then," then the car of police come, to signal the order of things. And then finally, the grammatical phase where they start to use things like the past tense, and suddenly she cried. Yeah. So this kind of 3-step process, which we saw very similar to children learning the first language, is more or less the same with people learning a second language naturalistically. So the conclusion is that if you look at these languages, however close they are or distant they are from each other in terms of their history, that more grammar does not necessarily make the task of the language learner harder. Just less does not make it easier. That is to say, just because a language looks like it has a lot of grammar, the process is more or less the same. So what is the process? Well, we've seen it's a kind of, it moves. Grammar is a kind of late acquired in terms of this early stage of learning, that a lot of the initial learning is lexical. It's through vocabulary and it's through formulaic expressions. People pick up little expressions, and kids do this in their first language, and learners do this in the second language, which then become unpacked a little bit later on down the line. But it's essentially lexis first. When we say lexis, meaning vocabulary, but not just words, but sequences of words, formulaic expressions that become grammaticized. So, for example, a study was done of a 11-year-old boy whose first language was Gujarati, an Indian language, learning English. And he picked up the expression, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. And he put it at the beginning of a sentence or the end of a sentence. That one, I don't know. Or I don't know, what's this? Yeah, that was a first stage, an unanalyzed chunk, we would call that. And then a little later, he started to attach or detach I don't from other verbs, add it with other verbs. I don't understand, I don't like. Yeah, but the starting point was this expression, I don't know. And then I don't understand, I don't like. And then he was able to detach the verb from the negative auxiliary and produce sentences like, I know this. So it started off with the negative, I don't know. And then later, I know this. And then at a later stage still, he was able to detach the pronoun, the subject pronoun, from the expression to produce more complex, fully grammaticized sentences like, you don't know where it is. So this process of learning formulaic language and sort of unpacking it over time seems to be a feature of not only of first language acquisition, but of second language acquisition, particularly in naturalistic circumstances, leading to the belief that the prevailing view today is that learners unpack the parts that comprise a sequence, and in this way discover the second language grammar. In other words, formulaic sequences serve as a kind of starter pack from which grammar is generated. It's not that grammar comes first, it's these formulaic sequences come first and they're unpacked. And then related to that, there's a kind of parallel process where some of these formulaic sequences become generalized into for different uses. So a very recent study that came out like literally this year looked at learners of French and how they use the expression je sais pas, which is a contraction of je ne sais pas, I don't know. Originally, these learners used it literally. So, what is the capital of Peru? Je sais pas. And then they started to use it as a kind of filler, when they're trying, to help them with their fluency or to modify, mitigate what they were saying. So I'm not sure I agree with you, je sais pas, blah, 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 yeah? So it's a kind of, it has a different function than its literal function. And then they're able to use it as a kind of discourse marker or interactional device. So for example, after a speaking turn, when they want to signal that they're finished, they say, je sais pas, meaning that's it, I've done, it's over to you. So you see this one chunk is being used for different purposes. And this again seems to be a common developmental stage. The construction, I don't know, or je sais pas, becomes routinized, becomes part of a routine beyond its literal meaning in this case. So there's a lot going on here that would suggest that whatever the language, the processes of acquisition seem to be common across languages, particularly in natural circumstances, that it's not grammar driven, that it's more lexical initially, and particularly language formulaic sequences. And I'll come back to that point in a second. So my third question is, if different languages are not acquired differently, and if all languages are equally difficult, then should they be taught differently? And I think you probably can predict the answer is probably not. But let's look at an example. This is a famous study that was done by a learner of Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese, called Dick Schmidt. And he was an academic, and he went to Brazil and he enrolled in a language class. And he kept a diary. This is part of a big research project of his learning of Brazilian Portuguese. And he describes in this particular class, he said the class started off with a discussion of the imperfect versus the perfect. Yeah, so two different tenses, if you like, with the teacher eliciting rules from the class. So this is, students who were kind of not total beginners. So they'd met these forms before. The teacher was eliciting the rules of how you use the imperfect and how you use the perfect. She ended up with more than a dozen rules on the board. Yeah, the differences between the two. And he says, which I'm never going to remember when I need them. Of it as background and foreground and hope that I can get a feel for the rest of it. And I think this is kind of interesting because this is not like, this is not a child. This is an academic. This is a person he's a linguist, and yet he can't remember a dozen rules when he needs them. So he's just going to make up a rule and see if it works. And I think this is a very common case of languages being taught as if they were Latin or Greek or dead languages, lots of rules, and then it's over to the learner to somehow internalize these. I have a friend who's learning Swedish at the moment. Who's an adult English speaker learning Swedish as a second language and enrolled in a class, and it's very, very, very similar. He describes it to me very, very similar to this experience with Dick Schmidt. And so, for example, this is from his course book, verbs in Swedish. There's 3 groups of verbs, and there's a subclass within one of those groups. And the teacher's expectation is that the learners will somehow be able to activate this knowledge in real time. And this friend of mine says, there's no way I can run through all these different verb forms and decide which verb it is and then what form it is. And he said, if only she would teach us or give us practice in just the most common forms of the most common verbs. Yeah? There's no way, he says, and he's an adult and an ex-teacher of English, can I hold that information in my head and use it? So what appears on the page to be an accurate description of the Swedish grammar is of very little use in terms of communicative use of the language in real time. And we've always known this. Harold Palmer, who's a linguist, applied linguist, methodology writer, grammar writer, said 100 years ago, he said, 100 years ago, certain moods and tenses are more useful than others. Let's therefore concentrate on the useful ones. She said, in a language possessing a number of cases, for example, like German, we will not learn off the whole set of prepositions, or the whole set of different inflections, but we will select them in accordance with their degree of importance. And he goes on to say, let us first learn these essentials and leave the details to a later stage. And I kind of, we lose sight of this, but let's learn the most important ones first. And in 1921, we didn't know really what were the most important ones, was intuition. Now we know because there's data, research, what are the most common forms of the language? And that's what I want to look at very quickly now. With reference initially to Swedish. This is from the same book. Now, I know nothing about Swedish, but I looked at this, adverbs. So what we have here, där, dit, and därifrån means there, to there, and from there. So which do you think is the most common? And then similarly here, which is the next one, and so on and so on. But they're presented as if they all had equal weight, in this course book. It's like, learn them all because they're all equally important. That's the implication. But if you go back to Harold Palmer, who's saying, no, some of these are going to be more common than others. So I just had a look. I went into, and this took me 10 minutes. I went into a Swedish database of Swedish, a corpus of Swedish, of contemporary Swedish, admittedly written Swedish. And I asked the corpus, which are the most common patterns? And you can do this for any language. There's hundreds of languages represented there. Look at, so I chose Swedish. I chose a sample of 45 million words of text in this corpus. And I said, what are the most common of these adverbs? Yeah, and the corpus is gathered off the web and the internet. It's a sample. So it is written, admittedly. And these are the figures. You know, I'm not going to bore you with this, but you can see that, for there, the position is much more common than the destination, which is more common, the destination to there, or from there. And in fact, if we look down the list, we'll see that some of them, the reverse is true. So uta, which is out, it's much more common to talk about going out than being out. Yeah, but it's very rare to talk about coming from out. And similarly, if you look down, the ones I've highlighted here, frama, for example, which means, this is me check, in front, it's much more common to talk about going to the front than coming from the front. In fact, it doesn't exist. Framifran just does not exist. In 45 million words of Swedish, there's not a single example of framifran. So in other words, by presenting the facts of the language like this, as if they were equal across all forms, we're misrepresenting what is most useful. And we have this information. Let's look at a language that some of you are more familiar with, which is Spanish. And again, all this information is available. If we look at, this is from a corpus of Spanish. Admittedly, it's written Spanish, it's not spoken Spanish. But these are the most common words in the corpus. When I say words, I'm talking about, well, let's look at it more closely. I'm talking about lemmas. Lemma is the kind of dictionary word. So the most common word in Spanish is el and la and lo. So they bundle them all together under el. Yeah, so these are not the individual forms. But if you look down the list, you'll see the verbs. What is one of the most common verbs? Well, it is our favorite, tener, 22nd most common word in Spanish and all its forms. If we look at that more closely, we'll see that if we look at the individual forms, we'll see that of tener, we'll see that number 55, the most common form of tener is tiene, yeah, third person present, el tiene. If we go into a corpus of Spanish, this is confirmed. Yeah, so I went into this corpus, it's free, it's available. If you don't know it, fantastic. And sure enough, in this corpus of Spanish, admittedly it's written Spanish, tiene is much more common than any of the other forms. Now, of course, if it was spoken Spanish, this would probably be slightly different. You probably find that tengo, I have, is more common. But nevertheless, these other forms, if you go down the list, are actually, they start to become very, very rare. Arguably not really worth focusing on until quite a later stage of learning. Then if we look at the way these words combine, you'll see that the most common combination of tiene is with derecho. Yeah? He has a right, or lugar, a place, or reason, or fear, or problems. Yeah? And that's just with the noun without the article. With an article, it's slightly different, but these are the kind of combinations. So what we have here is information which is invaluable in terms of, if you're going to teach the verb tener, maybe just first of all start teaching the third person form, ignore all the rest, and then teach it with these particular combinations. Similarly with tengo, yeah, I have. Tengo miedo is the most common. I'm afraid. Tengo ganas, I want. Yeah? Tengo tiempo, I have time, etc. What's interesting, incidentally, so you look at a lot of these nouns that collocate with these verbs, they are abstract nouns. You have to go down quite a lot to get down to 13 or 9, tengo amigos, yeah? I have friends, or tengo hijos, I have children. But a lot of these expressions are using abstract nouns. And similarly, when we add an article. And yeah, I could ask you, those of you who speak Spanish, what do you think is the most common noun which follows no tengo, the negative, I don't have? We don't have time, but again, it's what's interesting is that they tend to be abstract nouns rather than concrete nouns. It's not until 10, no tengo dinero, I don't have any money. you get something that is concrete. Everything else is abstract. But this is the information that we now have readily available. So what is it? And if you look at the proportion with articles, you can see that there are 3 there which are incredibly common. I don't have a doubt, I don't have a problem, I don't have any idea. So what I'm arguing here is that if you taught those expressions initially, you may be giving learners a foothold into the most useful grammar of the language. And of course, we know with tengo, it has a modal use, tengo que, I have to do, and these are the most common verbs that follow that construction. So we have this information, and here's another example. If you take teniendo, which is the gerund form, having, what does it most commonly collocate with? Well, again, looking at these examples from a corpus, almost all the examples of teniendo followed with en cuenta, taking into account. It's a great expression to teach. The only real way that the students need to know teniendo is that it combines with en cuenta. So this is an argument for what's sometimes called, or what is now called, a usage-based approach to teaching the language. That we learn a language by learning these, what they call constructions, teniendo en cuenta. The usage-based perspective implies that the acquisition of grammar is that bit by bit, the incremental, the piecemeal learning of many thousands of constructions, like I don't know, or je sais pas, and then we abstract the regularities from them. A really nice example of this comes from a course book published by Difusión here in Spain, where they focus on the expression with tengo, the expression no me tengo que olvidar de, I mustn't forget. So what you have is a situation, you have 3 people, they're going on a vacation, they have different places. One's going to the mountains, one's going to the beach. And the idea is that the learners have to generate sentences using this construction. So no me tengo que olvidar de botas or de ropa or de mochila or whatever. So I mustn't forget. I love this because this really focuses on a really useful chunk of language which embeds a really common form of the verb tener, but doesn't necessarily teach the whole conjugation, if you like. And if we look at the corpus again, we see that no me tengo que olvidar is the 3rd most common verb in that construction. So, we're kind of running out of time, so I might just run on a little bit. What we, I think, need to, if we're going to make modern languages alive and not teach them like dead languages, we need to focus on their use, their worldly use, how they're used in the world. And therefore, the process of learning should be use-based. And let me just run on to skip that. I can come back to that if necessary. My friend who's learning Swedish, as I said, he's slightly frustrated because the focus is on the grammar primarily, and all the grammar, all the forms of the verbs, etc. So what he's done, he's taking time, he's found a private teacher using this site, website, where you can enlist a one-to-one class on iTalki with a Swedish teacher. And once a week, he has a conversation class with the Swedish teacher. And that has been really, really useful to activate. So this is the use thing, putting the language to use. The teacher gives feedback, but she doesn't teach the grammar. They have a conversation for an hour, and this, in combination with the classes that he's doing at the Escuela Oficial, and plus activities like keeping word cards of Spanish, so writing the word in Spanish and its translation in English on the back and testing himself constantly, is helping activate. Now, what I'm suggesting is here, it's a shame that he has to go outside the class to find to find means of activating this. This really should be happening in the class. but because the focus of the class is so much on the grammar, he's not having these opportunities. I'm being unfair here to his teacher, because there is pair work, there's group work, etc. But the teacher is keeping a very strong control over the kind of language that the learners are allowed to use. So just to sum up, what are my takeaways from this? What do I see? First of all, I mean, I've answered in a sense no to all those three questions, that languages are no more difficult than each other, particularly if you're learning them naturally or as a first language. And they do not need to be taught differently just because they have, some of them have inflections and some of them don't. If language is learned through using it, then we need to set up conditions for learners to have some control over the content of the lesson. My friend is learning Swedish. When they go into pairs, the teacher says, okay, imagine you're in a situation, you meet somebody for the first time on the train and you're exchanging personal information. They go into the pairs, my friend starts to talk about himself, and the teacher says, no, don't use that, that's too difficult. You're going to use difficult grammar. Just talk about these people, you know, imagine, but use the language I've taught you. Not allowing the learners to generate their own content, which apart from anything else is going to make the learning process more motivating. Arguably then, grammar is taught at the point of need, when it's needed rather than preemptively. Yeah? Today I'm going to teach you this particular tense, and then you're going to use it. No, maybe have a conversation, and then where you have difficulties, if you want to use them, you know, I can teach you, we'll stop it and address the grammar. And very importantly, I think I've made no other point. I think this is the key one, is that at early levels, particularly, focus on these chunks, these formulaic expressions. No me tengo que olvidar. Yeah, or I don't know, or je sais pas. Yeah. And we do that, I think, a lot when we teach classroom language, like how do you say? We teach learners these expressions. How do you say? How do you translate? Could you write that, please, etc. Really, really useful expressions. That's a kind of process I think that needs to be developed even more. Encourage memorization of these high frequency examples, and then later break these down into their grammatical elements. And I think particularly the case for teaching children, but also I think adults, is exploiting activities where these high frequency expressions are repeated again and again and again. And I'm thinking particularly of songs and chants. A lot of the language that learners pick up is incidental. It's through listening to pop songs. And here is an example of a brilliant initiative by a teacher of German. You may be, those of you who teach German will be familiar with the work of Uwe Kind, but this is from a YouTube. Let's see if it works. Oh, sorry, one more point there. Reward, yeah. I mean, going back to the Common European Framework, reward competence, communicative competence rather than accuracy. But here's an example of chunks that are integrated into a song. And if you don't know German, see what German you learn. Das da, ja das.
Ich will den Porsche und das Geld. 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 Den Porsche, das Geld. Der Reise um die Welt. Ich weiß, was ich will. Ich weiß, was ich will. Ich will das. Ich weiß, was ich will.
If you get nothing else from this presentation, you've learned an expression, a very common expression in German. I think that's me done. We'll take that away, and I'm available now for your questions.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that very rich and enlightening talk that has certainly given us all a lot to think about in our teaching, and as we reflect on new possibilities for our classrooms. I now invite all of the participants, if you have questions that you've been formulating during the session that you haven't yet shared, please feel free to type them in the Q&A section below, and we'll get to as many as we can. So to start with, we had a question from Paulino Brenner, who asked if you could please clarify your definition of communication. There seems to be a shared idea that communication is just talking and writing, but interpretation of meaning is also communication.
Yeah, and that's a really good question. And in fact, we talk endlessly about the communicative approach, but we lose sight of what that actually means. And I think I would like, first of all, to make a distinction between communication and interaction. So just because students are interacting, like in pairs work, that doesn't necessarily mean they're communicating. When you're communicating, you are also interpreting, you're understanding, you're processing. So there's a big difference where two students are in pairs and you say, talk about what you did at the weekend. And so one student says, I did this, I did that, I did the other. The other one may not even be listening or processing. They're thinking about what they're going to say. It looks like they're interacting, but they're not listening to each other. But if you say to them, talk about what you did at the weekend and find 3 things in common, then you are communicating, because you've got to process, you've got to listen. Say, oh, okay, so you watch TV. Oh, so you went shopping. Okay, so you went to the beach. Yeah. These are our 3 things, and you tell the rest of the class. So at the very basic level, communicating is not just speaking, not just writing, but it's responding, which means understanding, it's processing. And that's a really, really important point. So there's a huge difference between activities which are simply interactive and activities which are really, truly communicative. But that's a great question. Thank you for asking that.
We also had a question here, Nicole Fierro, who says that out in Las Vegas, one of her big hindrances or challenges to doing more of these communicative interactive activities with her students is just the sheer class size in some of our public schools here in the United States. So do you have any suggestions for when you're dealing with a very large group of students, ways to make sure that they really do have that chance to process and interpret?
And that's a situation, I think, which is very common. And in fact, when I travel around the world, I often ask this question in context where students, there may be up to 60 or 80 students in a class. And so a lot of these activities, which sound great on paper, don't necessarily work, or they create a great deal of noise if you're doing them with 80 students, and thinking of like pair work or group work. However, well-constructed pair and group work is a great way of spreading the learning opportunities. And I think, but it has to be well planned. I think one of the things we've learned actually over the pandemic was how to use breakout rooms constructively. And breakout rooms, I think, are a huge challenge. To me, they're a challenge because I don't know about you, but when you put students into a breakout room, you can't see them or hear them until you go into the room, and then you lose all the others. So what we've had to do as teachers is become and also, you set them, put them into breakout rooms, and then you visit each room, and then you get to room 12, and the students are doing something completely different. They didn't understand the task. So one of the things we've learned is that got an incredibly clear task setting. This is what you're going to have to do. This is how you're going to do it. This is the outcome of what you're going to do. Yeah, if it's like report on what if you're going to talk about your weekend amongst yourselves, all 4 of you in the breakout room, then remember that you're going to have to tell us after when we come back into the main room, what the 3 things you all had in common were, kind of thing. So it means very, 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 very clear instructions and a clear outcome, and also clear models. Well, one of the things, particularly lower levels and children, and not just children, adults too, they need models that they can work from. One of the things I learned look, this is for teaching online. This is the most, I don't use the, in Zoom, the whiteboard, that I just use a board like this. So this is for an activity, which is, there is something here in the room that you can't see on my desk, yeah? You have to guess what it is by asking yes, no questions. But that's, but if you say to the students, do that, then 2 or 3 will start asking questions. The rest will be going, oh, so you've got to give them a model. So this is the model. Is it made of? Is it made of paper? Is it made of cotton? Is it bigger than? Is it bigger than a football? Is it bigger than a golf ball? Do you with it? Do you write with it? Do you drink with it? Do you eat with it, etc.? The model is so important. And then as the students are starting to get better with the questions, take this away. So they're relying on their memory. Yeah? Don't leave it there all the time, but start to erase things from it. So this is how you can make, even with a very large class, you can make these kinds of interactive activities. And that was with a full class, it could be 20 students, 25 students are asking me about something that they can't see. And then they go into pairs and do it with each other. Something that they have in their bag, that they're wearing, etc. The other has to guess what it is. But they've practiced it with the teacher first, so it's very, very, very clearly scaffolded, keyword, scaffolding, and then they can do it on their own. And then you've got it on the ball, you can start rubbing it off, so they're relying more and more. So yeah, all these activities about getting students to walk around asking each other questions, impossible in a class of like 25 students with fixed furniture. But pair work and group work are not impossible, but they need to be incredibly well structured. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. We have a question from Kristen Dombeck, who is asking that if the administration is led by data-driven instruction, what would you suggest for assessments with a communicative approach?
Well, I mean, yeah, assessment is the elephant in the room, isn't it? Because it's how we assess students is how we end up teaching them. And if they're being assessed, for example, on grammar, then we teach them the grammar because it's only fair. So, what's the alternative? We'll change the assessment. Well, we can't, maybe, that's an institutional thing. That's a ministry issue. That's all sorts of, but I think within our own classes, we can assess communicative competence by doing things like having students do a communicative task, like it could be a presentation to the rest of the class, which they can prepare, but they don't read it aloud. It should be done spoken. Or they can do, it could be a collaborative activity where students are doing a little dialogue. Like I said, a situation, you're on a train, you've met, you're having a conversation, or you're in a plane, talking to the person next to you you've never met before. So find out 5 interesting things about them. So the task for the testing is no different from the task for practicing. If we can do that, but then of course you need criteria for assessing the task. And if you're setting a communicative task, but you assess it because of accuracy, grammatical accuracy, then that's unfair. You should be assessing a communicative task on on communicative criteria. How intelligible were the students? Could they understand each other? Could I understand them? So this factors in things like pronunciation, etc. How fluent were they? Were they pausing a lot? Yeah, were they only saying 2 words at a time and then stop thinking? Yeah, that is something we can assess. That's to do with communicative effectiveness, not whether they use the right form of the verb. Okay, the right form of the verb, yeah, is important, but it's not the most important thing if they are being communicatively effective.
And so we actually have a question to sort of piggyback on that question, or related, when, approaching or sort of introducing a more communicative approach in our schools. How do you show admins that following a kind of more classical grammar heavy approach, as it were, doesn't necessarily lead to acquisition and fluency?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is the other challenge, is how we are accountable to the stakeholders, whether it's the institution we work for or the parents of the children we're teaching. I think this similar question came up in the survey before that. How do you convince your students' parents that they are learning if they're not coming home with long lists of words? Well, I mean, long lists of words I have no problem with if they are in the form of word cards, like I showed you. rather than lists. I mean, the advantage of word cards is that you can change the order all the time, yeah, and then you can throw out words that you know and add new ones. And the other advantage is it's now been digitalized, so there's lots of apps like Quizlet and Anki, etc., that kids can carry around their phone. They can show their parents, look, these are all the words I'm learning at the moment. But not just words, expressions. You know, the thing I keep wanting to emphasize is it's not just about learning individual words, it's learning common expressions with these words. And so that's easily demonstrated. Show the parents long lists of words, rather than just grammatical conjugations and things like that. Chunks of language, Graciana, exactly. Chunks, chunks, chunks. You know, yeah, I mean, we can't necessarily re-educate parents as to how languages are learned. I mean, if you have the opportunity to talk to the parents, obviously, then you can put your point of view across. But I mean, I think parents, if they were an institutions, if they thought about it for 2 seconds, would say, yeah, actually, communication is what it's all about. I really want these kids to come out being communicative in the language and not just having, you know, I did 6 years of French at school, and I couldn't, when I went to France, I couldn't order a cup of coffee. And I think, you know, it doesn't take a lot of convincing of parents to say they're not going to learn to be able to use French if all they know is all the declensions and all the conjugations of the French verb. So it's not a huge re-education task, but it's a challenge. I'm not underestimating it. It is a challenge. I think the problem is more within your own institution, how you persuade your institution that, look, I want to teach German so that people can use it rather than just simply know about it. That is a challenge. I don't have any easy answers to that, but I mean, the thing about teaching, of course, is that what we say we're doing, what we do, may be quite different things. I mean, teaching is one of those great jobs that once you close the door, you can sort of do more or less what you want in the classroom, short of, you know. You know, sometimes it may be a case of saying to the parents of the institution, yes, I am covering the grammar, we are doing the grammar, but in fact, in the class, that may be only 5 or 10 minutes of the lesson. I mean, one of the problems with grammar is that it expands to fill the time available for it. And we all know this as teachers. You say, okay, I'm going to teach them, I don't know, the imperfect in Portuguese, and it becomes the whole lesson, and they never get a chance to use it. But if you just say, I'm going to teach the imperfect, but we're just going to spend 5 minutes on very quick review, a couple of expressions of the imperfect, and then we're going to go into a practice activity where we use it. And then if the learners are having problems, then we can readdress it or give them some homework where they, you know, some boring exercises, but, you know, do it at home. Don't do the boring stuff in the classroom. Classrooms, I think one of the things we've learned from the pandemic is that we love classrooms. We love classrooms because they are physical places where people can look at each other, move around, yeah, touch each other. They can use language in the way that it is best, most commonly used in the world, rather than in breakout rooms. But anyway, that's another. Sorry, Catherine, any more questions?
Thank you. That's wonderful. And yeah, nice that we are actually moving into more proximity now rather than being 6 feet apart and trapped in our Zoom windows. So I know how enthusiastic we all are about that. Another question from Paulino, who wants to know if you have some examples of methodologies or methods for language teaching that align with the communicative approach.
Yes, I mean, let me give another example of an activity, I think, which gets across, which reinforces the point I was making before about interaction versus communication. I mean, one of the iconic activities associated with the communicative approach is the activity called Find Someone Who. And this really works much better in a classroom if they can move around, but it's not impossible to do it seated, or it's not impossible to do it online. Now, Find Someone Who is, I'm sure you all know it. So they're going to survey everybody in the class, and it may be about, for example, a particular topic. Yeah, it needs to be focused on a topic. So it may be about health or nutrition or sport, or it could be about movies, or it could be about shopping, it could be about travel. But let's say it's about health. And so the object of the activity, you tell the class, is we're going to find who's the most health conscious person in the class. So you're going to go to groups and you're going to come up with some questions. You can give them some prompts. Do you exercise regularly? Do you go to the gym? Do you look at the packets, to see what's in the food you buy in the supermarket, that kind of thing. So they can come up with questions which are within their competence, but you'll find that a lot of those questions repeat the same kind of structure. Do you, do you, do you, do you? Or how often do you? How often do you? Yeah, you can give that. You can give that as a model on the board. So they prepare their questions, and then either they go into different groups, you regroup them, or if it's practicable, they stand up and move around, but that's not always practical, but it's the best version of it. They go around asking these questions to find someone who does all these things. They're asking because they have to listen to the answers, because they're going to have to report on the results. They have to listen. So it's the processing. Yeah, they don't understand. They have to ask. Sorry, I didn't understand. So that's real communication. They go back to their original groups with their answers to all the people they've asked, and they collate that information. Yeah, so they say 5 out of 10 people in this class exercise regularly. Nobody in this class always eats junk food, that kind of thing. Yeah, they collate. So again, they're recycling the same kind of grammar and the vocabulary, all this useful language, which they may not know initially. And that's where the teacher has to kind of like monitor the group work, the preparation stage, to say, what are you trying to say here? They collate the information, and then they report the information that they've gathered to the rest of the class. So again, there's a third stage, not just writing it, but reporting it. Now, reporting it to the class is a really important activity, because you're standing in front of the class. So each group has a spokesperson. Not everybody's going to report, but knowing that you're going to report means that you're going to have to pay attention at the collating stage. Knowing that you're going to have to report also means you're going to have to pay attention at the speaking stage. So because the outcome is very clear, you're going to decide who is the most health conscious person in the class. And you're going to tell us, and why. So the student's going to stand up in front of the class and say, in our group, we discovered that. And you can give them those expressions. 10 out of 20 students go to the gym regularly, that kind of thing. Then that would be an example of a total 100% communicative task. And it has all these ingredients. There's preparation, there's repetition, because they're asking the same question to lots of different students. Do you go to the gym? How often do you go to the gym? How often do you go to the gym? Repetition. We know repetition is good for language learning, but not mindless repetition, everybody chanted together, but going around, and then they're processing, and then they're reporting, etc. So, and it's got a speaking stage, and it's got a writing stage, it's got a private stage, it's got a public stage. So that kind of activity, you cannot do enough of those kinds of activities. And you can design activity like that for any topic you're doing. So the course book topic is about shopping. Well, we're going to design a survey about shopping. Off you go. Or it's about travel, same thing. Sport, whatever. Music, whatever. You can do it.
Wonderful. Thank you. A question we have that is something that, especially here in a US context, we see a lot of, or have a lot of questions about, is when you have a mix in your classroom, say of L2 learners and heritage learners, who are going to have different needs in terms of the vocabulary they've already been exposed to, the structures that they've already been exposed to. How do you, what are those different needs that they might have in the classroom in your experience, and how do you sort of adjust for or account for them in the classroom setting?
That's a very real issue. I think it's less a question of needs. I mean, the long-term needs for learning the language is all going to be the same, whether they're coming from it as a first language or as a second language, particularly as you go up through the academic thing. I mean, those who are going on to, preparing for tertiary education or whatever, they're going to need to be able to write text at a kind of academic level, etc. But I mean, I think the starting point is going to be different. And again, coming back to these kinds of activities I'm talking about, activities where learners can participate using whatever means they have, are great. One writer on methodology called Penny talks about these as being heterogeneous activities. Heterogeneous means they're kind of mixed ability activities. So let's say, for example, another classic communicative activity, not dissimilar from what I just described, but a simpler version of, is where you write on the board a table which goes, one of us, let's say you want to practice can, you were teaching English, one of us can, ... two of us can, ... three of us can, four of us can, none of us can. And they go into groups and they have to generate as many true sentences using that formula. And it's a bit like the activity I showed you in Spanish. No me tengo que olvidar. Yeah, so students write. Now, some students will have lots of vocabulary and be able to say, you know, one of us can stand on our head, or two of us can, I don't know,
Play tennis.
Yes, exactly. Some students will only be able to say, one of us can drive. Yeah, that's all I know. But it fits into that context. But each student can contribute to that activity. They're not left out. That's the important thing. So it's designing activities which give a certain amount of freedom to people to contribute however well, you know, whatever vocabulary in this case. And you're giving them the grammar because it's there in the pattern. So all they have to do, the weaker students, is just like sing, drive, eat. It doesn't matter, but they're participating. And then, of course, by participating and hearing all these sentences being generated, then reported, they'll pick up stuff that they didn't know from the better students. But everybody is being treated as if they could. You know, this is the difference between traditional teaching, is that today I'm going to teach you X because I'm assuming you don't know it. A kind of communicative approach is, today you're going to do something with language that you can do in your first language, and I'm going to help you do it better as a teacher. So I'm going to give you the words, I'm going to give you the structure, etc. Or the other students are going to help you do it better.
Great.
That's my
Thank
short
you
answer.
so much. I think we are coming up on the end of our time here. So I just really want to thank you, Scott, for your generosity, for all of this vast wealth of knowledge and concrete examples and activities that you've shared with us that can certainly be of use to all of us in our teaching. And I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us this evening, and we hope that you will join us as well for our subsequent webinars. If you're not already signed up for our newsletter, please do so that you can remain informed about our all of our professional development activities and join us for those as well. And thank you everyone so much for your time, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Colette. Thank you, everybody. Thanks very much for participating. Thank you, Camila. Thank you, Sergio, here in Spain. And it's been great talking to you and interacting with you all. So I'll say good night.
Good night, bonne nuit. Buenas noches.
We're going to put a couple of links in the chat for everyone that's still around, and we'll send it in an email later. But we're going to send the PowerPoint slides link here into the chat. So feel free to grab that. Grabbing it quickly. Okay, and then we also have the link for our next webinar coming up next week. And so if you are interested in that, please feel free to join us. We would love to have you. So that's with Linda. And we also have a teaser. So let me add that to the chat here. We just have all the links for you. Feel free to take advantage of all of them. We have, let's see, I put in the PowerPoint slides, good. And then of course, I'll retype in our link to our conference. So definitely check that out. We would love to see you in October. Lots of really cool, fun sessions and speakers. So join us for that as well. So those are all the links. Thank you so much again. We will be sending out a survey. We would love to have your feedback just so that we know what we're doing well and what we can be doing better and what type of content you all are interested in. So thank you again and have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much.